In 1969, Parisians gathered on Avenue Foch to witness something unthinkable: the destruction of one of the most magnificent palaces ever built in their city. Bulldozers tore through marble staircases that had once welcomed European royalty. Wrecking balls smashed through ballrooms where thousands had danced beneath crystal chandeliers. And as the pink marble columns crumbled into dust, an entire era died with them. This wasn't just any building. This was the Palais Rose, a palace so extravagant, so impossibly beautiful, that its very existence seemed like a fever dream from another world. The American heiress and the impoverished aristocrat. The story of the Palais Rose begins not in Paris, but in the gilded ballrooms of New York's Fifth Avenue, where European nobility came hunting for American fortunes. The year was 1895, and Count Boniface de Castellane, known to everyone as Boney, had crossed the Atlantic with a singular mission. He needed money, and he needed it desperately. Boney came from one of the oldest families in France, a lineage so ancient that they considered even Charlemagne a bit of an upstart. But ancient bloodlines couldn't pay the bills, and by the 1890s, the Castellane fortune had dwindled to almost nothing. What Boney did have was charm, impeccable taste, and the kind of aristocratic bearing that made American heiresses swoon. He was tall, elegant, and impossibly vain, exactly the sort of European nobleman that wealthy American families dreamed their daughters would marry. Anna Gould was not the prettiest woman in New York society. She was short, awkward, and whispers suggested she had a slight curvature of the spine. What she did have was approximately 440 million euros in today's money, inherited from her father, Jay Gould, one of America's most ruthless railroad tycoons. When Boney met Anna at a New York party, he saw not a woman, but a solution to all his problems. The unkind joke that circulated through Paris society later captured his pragmatism perfectly. When asked about his new wife's appearance, Boney supposedly replied that she looked much better when viewed through her dowry. The wedding took place in March 1895, and within months, Boney had Anna back in Paris, ready to spend her fortune in ways that would shock even the extravagant Belle Epoque society. But before we continue with what Boney built with Anna's millions, you need to understand just how completely he would transform those millions into something the world had never seen before. A palace rises from ambition. On May 18th, 1895, Boney purchased a massive plot of land on what was then called Avenue du Bois, today's Avenue Foch. The location was perfect, nestled near the Bois de Boulogne in the most fashionable district of Paris. But Boney didn't want to build just another mansion. He wanted to create a palace that would make Versailles jealous. He hired architect Ernest Sanson, who had built grand homes for France's wealthiest families, and gave him an impossible task: recreate the Grand Trianon at Versailles, but make it even more magnificent. Sanson accepted the challenge, and for the next 6 years, an army of craftsmen worked to bring Boney's fever dream to life. The palace was designed in a U-shape, with marble columns imported from the same quarries that had supplied stone for Versailles 2 centuries earlier. The exterior featured massive windows with rounded arches, and the entire facade was adorned with pink marble pillars that gave the palace its name, the Palais Rose. Every architectural detail was copied from authentic 18th century designs, down to the smallest moulding and cornice. But it was inside where Boney's obsession with perfection reached its peak. The crown jewel was the Grand Staircase, a recreation of the legendary Escalier des Ambassadeurs, the Ambassadors' Staircase, that had once existed at Versailles before King Louis XV had it torn down in 1752. No photographs of the original staircase existed, only architectural drawings and written descriptions, which made Sanson's task even more challenging. He studied every available document, consulted with historians, and then built something that hadn't been seen in over 140 years. The result was breathtaking. The staircase rose in sweeping curves, constructed from 7 different types of marble: pink, white, black, green, red, grey, and cream, each chosen for its specific colour and veining pattern. Golden balustrades lined the steps, and massive mirrors multiplied the light from hundreds of candles. When guests climbed those stairs, they ascended not just to the palace's upper floors, but into a reimagined past where kings still ruled France. The ballroom could accommodate 1,000 guests dancing beneath painted ceilings that depicted mythological scenes in elaborate gilded frames. The dining room, decorated in shades of pale green inspired by the Pavillon Français at Versailles, could seat 150 people at formal dinners. A private theatre with 150 velvet seats offered entertainment for intimate audiences. A music room held a concert-quality piano and hosted performances by the era's greatest musicians. Every room was stuffed with treasures that Bonny collected with manic enthusiasm. He purchased Gobelin tapestries, old master paintings, a 13th century carpet from Lisbon Cathedral, and a clock that had been gifted by Louis XIV to the Pope. He acquired 18th century furniture by the wagon load, sometimes buying entire room contents from chateaux that had fallen on hard times. His eye was impeccable, his taste refined, and his spending absolutely relentless. The gardens designed by Achille Duchesne, the most celebrated landscape architect of the era, spread across the grounds in geometric perfection. Fountains splashed, statues lined gravel walks, and carefully trimmed hedges created outdoor rooms as formally arranged as those inside the palace. By 1902, the Palais Rose was complete. It had cost 4 million francs in gold, an astronomical sum that would translate to well over 100 million euros today. Anna's fortune had paid for every marble column, every golden chandelier, every priceless painting, and now Bonny was ready to show Paris what true extravagance looked like. What happened next would define the Palais Rose's golden age, but also plant the seeds of its ultimate destruction, the golden age of excess. The parties at the Palais Rose became legendary almost instantly. Bonny didn't just host dinners, he staged productions. For a single evening's entertainment, he might hire 500 servants, imported champagne by the caseload, and invite up to 2,000 guests. The invitations were coveted by everyone in European high society. To be invited to the Palais Rose meant you had arrived. To be excluded was social death. The preparation for these events was as extravagant as the parties themselves. Bonny would spend days selecting menu items, consulting with his head chef about which dishes would impress his guests. The wine cellar was stocked with vintages that collectors would have killed to own. Florists transformed the palace with arrangements that cost more than most people's annual income, and Bonny himself would oversee every detail, from the placement of each chair to the timing of each musical performance. On December 12, 1905, Bonny and Anna hosted what may have been the most spectacular party of the Belle Époque, a reception for the King and Queen of Spain and the King of Portugal. The palace was transformed into something from a fairy tale. Every chandelier blazed with light. Rivers of champagne flowed. Orchestras played in multiple rooms. The guest list included virtually every important person in Europe: aristocrats, diplomats, artists, and wealthy industrialists. The event was reported in newspapers across the continent, cementing the Palais Rose's reputation as the centre of Parisian glamour. Guests would arrive at the palace entrance and be greeted by footmen in elaborate livery. They would ascend the grand staircase, that magnificent recreation of Versailles' lost glory, while Bonny stood at the top like a king receiving courtiers. The image became iconic in Paris society. Count de Castellane, at the summit of his pink marble stairs, looking down at the ascending guests with an expression of satisfaction that bordered on smugness. The parties typically began with champagne reception in one of the drawing rooms, where guests could admire Bonnie's latest acquisitions. He loved showing off his treasures, explaining the provenance of each piece with the enthusiasm of a curator giving a private tour. Then dinner would be served in the green dining room, with courses that lasted for hours. After dinner, guests might attend a private performance in the theatre, or dance in the ballroom, or simply wander the palace admiring its beauty. Bonnie presided over these events with the bearing of a king welcoming subjects to court. He had achieved what he'd always wanted, not just wealth, but recognition as one of the great tastemakers of his generation. People who attended his parties never forgot them. The combination of authentic historical architecture, priceless art, exceptional food and wine, and the cream of society created experiences that seemed impossible to replicate. Artists and intellectuals mixed with royalty and industrialists. You might find yourself conversing with a duchess before dinner and a celebrated painter afterward. The salon-style gatherings in smaller rooms allowed for the kind of witty conversation that French society prized, while the larger parties in the ballroom offered spectacle and display. Bonnie understood that successful entertaining required variety, intimate moments and grand gestures, intellectual stimulation and pure sensory pleasure. But underneath all this glamour, the marriage was disintegrating. Bonnie had never loved Anna. He'd married her for money, and everyone knew it. Once he had her fortune at his disposal, he saw no reason to pretend affection. He was flagrantly unfaithful, carrying on affairs with actresses and society beauties, while Anna endured the humiliation of reading about her husband's romances in gossip columns. His most notorious affair was with Madame Schneider, whose family owned the famous Creusot steelworks. Their relationship was conducted openly, with Bonnie escorting her to the opera and restaurants while his wife remained at home. He showed no shame about his behaviour, seemingly believing that his aristocratic status gave him the right to do as he pleased. This wasn't an affair conducted in secret. It was a public display that humiliated Anna in front of all of Paris society. The social rules of the Belle Époque gave men enormous latitude in their behaviour, but even by those relaxed standards, Bonnie's conduct was shocking. Married men might discreetly take mistresses, but they were expected to at least maintain appearances. Bonnie didn't bother. He seemed to take perverse pleasure in flaunting his infidelity, as if proving that he was too aristocratic, too sophisticated, too important to be constrained by middle-class notions of marital fidelity. Anna might have tolerated the infidelity if Bonnie had shown any financial restraint, but he was incapable of moderation. In 1899, he purchased and restored the Château du Marais in Essonne. He bought another chateau in Drôme, not to live in, but to strip of its valuable architectural elements for resale. He acquired a private yacht. He hired the entire Bois de Boulogne for private parties. The spending was constant, relentless, and utterly unsustainable. Later, when reflecting on his spending, Bonnie would admit that collecting had been an addiction as powerful as gambling. He described himself as driven by a passion he couldn't control, decorating the Palais Rose as a slide into an abyss. But at the time, he showed no awareness that his behaviour was destructive. He simply spent, believing that Anna's fortune was infinite and that his taste justified any expenditure. Anna's American family watched this hemorrhaging fortune with growing alarm. The Goulds hadn't built their wealth by allowing European aristocrats to spend it on marble staircases and mistresses. They began pressuring Anna to leave, to protect what remained of her inheritance before Bonnie spent every penny. Her brothers sent letters. Her relatives visited and spoke bluntly about her husband's behaviour. But Anna, caught between her marriage vows and her family's warnings, hesitated. What finally pushed her to act wasn't just the spending or even the infidelity. It was the realization that Bonnie would never change. He saw nothing wrong with his behaviour. In his mind, He was living exactly as an aristocrat should live, and Anna's fortune merely allowed him to fulfill his birthright. He felt no gratitude toward her, no obligation to respect her wishes, no consideration for her feelings. She was simply the source of money that made his life possible. The end came with brutal efficiency. One morning in early 1906, Anna simply packed her belongings, took their 3 sons, dismissed all the servants, and locked the doors of the Palais Rose behind her. Bonnie returned to find himself locked out of his own palace, his wife gone. His life of luxury ended with the finality of a slammed door. The divorce proceedings were swift and merciless. Anna received custody of the children and control of her remaining fortune. Bonnie was left with debts, a reputation for profligacy, and no way to maintain the palace he had built. To twist the knife further, Anna married Bonnie's own cousin, the Duke Élie de Talleyrand-Périgord, creating a scandal that Paris society discussed for years. The choice seemed calculated to hurt Bonnie as much as possible. Not only had she left him, but she'd chosen a man from his own family, someone he would inevitably encounter at social gatherings. When Bonnie heard about the remarriage, he supposedly commented with dark humour that he and the Duke had served in the same unit, a crude reference to both men having been married to Anna. It was vintage Bonnie, witty, cruel, and utterly shameless even in defeat. And the Palais Rose sat empty, waiting for a future that would prove far darker than anyone could have imagined: the abandoned palace. After the divorce, Bonnie's personal monogram was scraped off the walls of the Palais Rose, but the building itself remained standing, a monument to extravagance and folly. The palace changed hands several times, with wealthy buyers unable to resist its beauty even as they struggled with the astronomical costs of maintaining it. Bonnie himself reinvented his life with remarkable grace. He published memoirs titled The Art of Being Poor, a darkly humorous take on his fall from wealth. He became an antiques dealer, using his exceptional eye and knowledge to build a new career. Ironically, the man who had squandered millions now helped American collectors spend their fortunes more wisely than he had spent his own. He even founded La Demeure Historique, an association dedicated to preserving historic private buildings, perhaps recognizing too late the value of architectural heritage. He died in 1932, having lived his final decades in relative poverty, but with his sense of style intact. His children inherited some furniture and artworks from the Palais Rose, but the palace itself had long since passed beyond the family's control. Then came World War II, and the Palais Rose entered its darkest chapter yet. War comes to the palace. When German forces occupied Paris in 1940, they requisitioned grand buildings throughout the city for military and administrative purposes. The Palais Rose, with its vast spaces and central location, was too tempting to ignore. Nazi officers moved into Bonnie's carefully decorated rooms, treating the palace as just another piece of conquered French property. The occupation was not kind to the building. While the Germans didn't deliberately destroy it, the conversion to military offices meant that rooms designed for elegant parties now housed filing cabinets and radio equipment. The ballroom, where thousands had danced, became a storage area. The theatre hosted strategy meetings. The gardens, once so carefully maintained, grew wild as groundskeepers fled or were conscripted. After Paris's liberation in 1944, the Palais Rose briefly served a different historical purpose. The building became a venue for diplomatic conferences addressing Europe's post-war future. In 1948, and again in 1951, representatives from the world's major powers met in the Palais Rose to debate the fate of Germany and Austria. There's archival footage of these meetings, men in dark suits sitting at long tables in rooms that had been built for beauty rather than diplomacy, making decisions that would reshape the continent. For a brief moment, it seemed the Palais Rose might transition into a useful role as a conference centre or museum. The building's historical significance had grown beyond Bonnie's personal story. It had witnessed both world wars and participated in shaping the peace that followed. But Paris in the 1950s and 60s was changing rapidly. The post-war building boom was transforming the city's skyline. Developers looked at historic buildings and saw not heritage, but wasted space. Land that could be cleared and rebuilt with profitable modern apartments. And the Palais Rose, sitting on prime real estate near the Bois de Boulogne, represented an enormous financial opportunity, the battle to save a palace. By the mid-1960s, the Palais Rose's condition had deteriorated badly. Years of military occupation and neglect had damaged the building. The maintenance costs were staggering. Marble needed constant care. The elaborate decorations required specialized restoration, and heating a palace that size was prohibitively expensive. No single family could afford to live there anymore, and no institution seemed willing to take responsibility for preserving it. In 1968, the property was purchased by a real estate developer. The plan was simple and brutal: demolish the Palais Rose and build a modern apartment building in its place. The developer would make millions. Paris would lose one of its most magnificent buildings. News of the planned demolition sparked immediate outrage. Architectural historians argued that the Palais Rose was an irreplaceable example of Belle Époque architecture, one of the finest private palaces ever built in Paris. The recreation of the ambassador's staircase alone was of enormous historical significance. It was the only way to see what that legendary Versailles feature had looked like. Artists and writers protested that destroying such beauty was an act of cultural vandalism. A campaign began to have the building classified as a historical monument, which would have legally protected it from demolition. Petitions circulated. Newspaper articles appeared. Preservationists argued that Paris's character depended on maintaining its architectural heritage, not replacing it with modern boxes. But the campaign faced powerful opposition. The developer had invested significant money in the property and had no intention of losing that investment. More troubling, the city planning authorities seemed indifferent to the preservation arguments. Paris was modernizing, they argued, and that meant making tough choices about which buildings to keep and which to sacrifice to progress. The final decision fell to André Malraux, France's Minister of Culture. Malraux was a celebrated novelist and art historian who had spent his career championing cultural preservation. If anyone could be expected to save the Palais Rose, it would be him. But Malraux said no. He refused to classify the building as a historical monument. Without that classification, there was no legal way to stop the demolition. His reasoning seemed to be that the Palais Rose, magnificent as it was essentially a replica rather than an original creation. The copied elements from Versailles, however beautifully executed, didn't constitute true innovation worthy of preservation. It was a devastating decision that preservationists never forgave. They pointed out that Malraux had also failed to protect many of Hector Guimard's Art Nouveau metro entrances, which were being destroyed around the same time. The Bastille station, one of Guimard's masterpieces, was bulldozed while Malraux was Minister of Culture. His conventional taste and narrow definition of what constituted important architecture seemed to blind him to buildings that fell outside his preferred aesthetic. The classification was rejected. The protest continued but had no legal force, and in 1969 the demolition began. The destruction. The demolition of the Palais Rose was not a quick process. The building had been constructed too well, with materials too substantial to fall easily. Crews spent weeks tearing apart what had taken years to build. The process was documented in photographs that now serve as painful reminders of what was lost. First came the stripping of valuable materials. Anything that could be salvaged and sold was removed. Marble pieces, decorative elements, Whatever might fetch a price from collectors who recognized quality even as the building died around them. This selective salvage meant the palace was eviscerated before it was destroyed, its treasures scattered to private collections around the world. Fireplaces were pulled from walls, gilded mirrors were carefully extracted, even sections of the famous staircase were removed piece by piece, though where these pieces ended up remains largely unknown. Workers moved through rooms that had once hosted Europe's elite, now wielding crowbars and sledgehammers instead of champagne glasses. The chandeliers came down first, their crystals packed away for resale. The painted ceilings that had depicted mythological scenes were lost. There was no way to save them, so they were simply destroyed. Boiseries that had cost fortunes were ripped from walls, sometimes carefully and sometimes not. Then the heavy machinery moved in. Wrecking balls smashed through walls that had been constructed from precisely cut stone. The grand staircase, that magnificent recreation that had taken skilled craftsmen years to build, was reduced to rubble in days. The 7 types of marble that had been so carefully selected and assembled were mixed together in piles of broken stone, their individual colours no longer serving any aesthetic purpose, but simply marking different shades of debris. The ballroom ceiling crashed down, destroying the painted mythological scenes. Room by room, the palace was reduced to broken marble and twisted metal. Windows that had framed views of the gardens shattered. Doors that had swung open to welcome kings were thrown into dumpsters. The green dining room, where 150 guests had once dined, was demolished so thoroughly that nothing remained to show it had ever existed. Photographers documented the destruction, and their images are almost painful to look at. You can see the grand staircase partially destroyed, its elegant curves broken, marble dust covering everything. You can see intact rooms next to ones that have been reduced to rubble, creating surreal contrasts between beauty and destruction. You can see the palace's facade with gaping holes where the wrecking balls had struck, like wounds in the building's body. The demolition attracted spectators who came to witness the end of an era. Parisians who remembered the Palais Rose's glory days stood behind barriers and watched machines tear it apart. Some were silent, some wept, some shouted in protest, but none could stop what was happening. The developer had the law on his side, and the work continued regardless of public sentiment. The process revealed the palace's construction in reverse. As outer walls came down, interior spaces were exposed to the sky. You could see the elaborate plasterwork of the ceilings, now open to rain. You could see decorative mouldings that had been hidden in shadow for decades, now fully lit by sunlight they were never meant to see. The palace was being turned inside out before it disappeared entirely. The pink marble columns that had given the palace its name and its romantic appearance were among the last elements to fall. When they finally came down, shattering into chunks that would be hauled away as fill material, the Palais Rose officially ceased to exist as anything but memory. Workers loaded the broken marble into trucks, and it was driven away to be crushed and used as aggregate in construction projects. The columns that had supported one of Paris's most beautiful buildings would be ground into gravel for parking lots and sidewalks. A few pieces survived. Some furniture and artworks that had belonged to Bonny passed through his descendants and occasionally surfaced at auction. In 2017, Christie's in Paris sold remaining pieces from the collection, including magnificent Louis XVI furniture by master craftsmen, porcelain from Sèvres, and a spectacular Venetian painting by Guardi estimated between 4 and 6 million euros. These sales gave younger generations glimpses of the extraordinary objects that had filled the palace, but seeing isolated pieces in auction catalogues only emphasised the loss of the complete environment Bonny had created. The sales catalogue described the provenance of each piece, explaining that these objects had once adorned the Palais Rose. For collectors and historians, this provenance added value. These weren't just beautiful objects, but pieces with documented history and importance. They had been selected by Bonny de Castellane, displayed in one of Belle Époque Paris's most important settings, and survived the palace's destruction. They were refugees from a vanished world. On the site where the Palais Rose had stood, the developer built exactly what he had promised: a modern apartment building, indistinguishable from thousands of others constructed during that era. Practical, profitable, and utterly without the character or beauty of what it had replaced. The building has balconies and large windows that provide good light for the apartments inside. It's competently designed and perfectly functional. It's also completely forgettable. Today, people live in those apartments with no idea that their building occupies the site of one of Paris's most spectacular palaces. They sleep where ballrooms once rang with music. They cook dinner where grand staircases once rose. They park their cars where gardens once bloomed. The past has been completely erased, replaced by a present that serves current needs without acknowledging what was sacrificed to create it. The destruction of the Palais Rose became a symbol of everything wrong with 1960s urban development. It represented the triumph of commerce over culture, of short-term profit over long-term heritage, of modern efficiency over historical beauty. For preservationists, it became a rallying cry, a warning about what could be lost when architectural heritage wasn't legally protected: the legacy of loss. Today, almost nothing remains to show where the Palais Rose once stood. The apartment building at 50 Avenue Foch gives no indication that one of Paris's most spectacular palaces occupied that spot for 67 years. There's no plaque, no marker, nothing to tell passing pedestrians what was lost on that ground. Only about a dozen photographs of the Palais Rose's interior exist, most of poor quality. These grainy images show glimpses of the grand staircase, the ballroom, fragments of decorated rooms, enough to understand that something extraordinary was lost, but not enough to fully capture its splendour. It's as if the palace has been erased, not just physically, but from visual memory as well. The comparison to other Belle Époque palaces makes the loss even more painful. The Petit Palais and Grand Palais, built for the 1900 Paris Exposition, still stand and function as museums. The Jacquemart-André Museum preserves a magnificent private mansion and art collection. The Musée Nissim de Camondo shows how a wealthy family lived during the same era. These buildings allow modern visitors to understand the luxury and artistry of the period. But the Palais Rose would have offered something unique, not a public building or a preserved family home, but a recreation of royal grandeur on a scale that even other private palaces couldn't match. The ambassador's staircase alone would have been worth preserving as an educational tool, showing what Versailles once contained, but lost. The demolition also robbed historians of a case study in Belle Époque taste and spending. Bonny's palace documented how American fortunes were spent in Europe during the Gilded Age, how historical styles were revived and reinterpreted, and how social ambitions shaped architectural choices. All of that contextual information was lost when the building came down. Perhaps most tragically, the destruction was entirely preventable. Unlike buildings damaged by war or destroyed by fire, the Palais Rose was deliberately torn down by choice. It wasn't beyond saving. It just wasn't deemed worth saving by the people who had the power to protect it. The irony is that Bonny himself had recognised the value of architectural preservation. The man who built the Palais Rose had founded La Demeure Historique specifically to save historic buildings. He understood, perhaps too late in his own case, that France's architectural heritage represented cultural wealth more valuable than any individual fortune. The organisation he created continues its work today, having saved countless buildings from the fate that befell his greatest creation. Why it matters today? The story of the Palais Rose resonates now perhaps more than ever. In an era when historic buildings face constant pressure from development, when every piece of land is evaluated primarily for its commercial potential, the lessons from 1969 remain urgently relevant. The Palais Rose would have been a major tourist attraction if it still existed. Visitors fascinated by Belle Époque Paris would have flocked to see its rooms. It could have functioned as a museum, an event venue, or a cultural centre. Instead of generating revenue for developers in 1969, it could have been generating tourism income for Paris for over 50 years. This economic argument matters because preservationists today often fight battles using cultural arguments while developers wield financial ones. The Palais Rose demonstrates that preservation can make financial sense over time. The short-term profits from demolition and redevelopment are dwarfed by the long-term value of maintaining unique buildings that draw visitors and maintain a city's character. The story also illustrates how quickly extraordinary things can disappear when legal protections fail. Without classification as a historical monument, even a palace could be demolished on a developer's whim. This reality drove changes in preservation law, making it easier to protect significant buildings before they're threatened. But battles over heritage versus development continue in every major city. There's also a human dimension to the story that makes it compelling beyond architectural history. Bonny de Castellane was neither purely a hero nor a villain. He was vain, selfish, unfaithful, and absurdly extravagant. He treated his wife terribly and squandered her fortune on his own vanity. Yet he also had exquisite taste, created something of genuine beauty, and spent his later years genuinely working to preserve what others had built. His complexity makes him fascinating. He embodied both the best and worst of his era. Anna Gould's story deserves recognition too. She was mocked for her appearance, married for her money, publicly humiliated by her husband's affairs, and yet she was smart enough to escape when her family's warnings finally broke through. She went on to a happier second marriage and kept control of her fortune. She was no passive victim, but an early example of a wealthy woman refusing to tolerate abuse simply because society expected her to endure it. The Palais Rose's fate reminds us that preservation isn't automatic, that beauty doesn't protect itself, and that decisions made by bureaucrats and developers can erase irreplaceable heritage. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when short-term thinking prevails over long-term vision. The other Palais Rose buildings. The story becomes more complicated when we realise that the Palais Rose on Avenue Foch wasn't the only building with that name. The name was used for several Belle Époque buildings inspired by the same Grand Trianon aesthetic, and the survival of these other structures makes the loss of Bonny's palace even more poignant. There was a Palais Rose at Le Vésinet, built around 1900 for engineer Arthur Schweitzer and later owned by the aesthete Robert de Montesquieu. That building survived, though it was subdivided and lost much of its original grandeur. Another building, sometimes called the Palais Rose, still stands at 3 Rue d'Andigné in Paris's 16th arrondissement, built around 1921 and frequently used as a filming location. This building was purchased by tech entrepreneur Xavier Niel in 2005 and remains in private hands. These survivals prove that not all Belle Époque palaces met the same fate. Some were saved by timely classification, by owners who valued preservation, or simply by luck. The buildings that survived can now be appreciated as rare examples of an architectural style that was much more common before the demolition wave of the 1960s swept through Paris. But none of these other buildings matched the scale, ambition, or historical significance of Bonny's Palais Rose. None featured a recreation of the ambassador's staircase. None had hosted quite such spectacular parties, or witnessed quite such dramatic personal stories. The building that was lost was the most important one, which makes its destruction all the more tragic. The Palais Rose stood for 67 years, a relatively short lifespan for a building of such quality. From its completion in 1902 to its demolition in 1969, it witnessed the final gasp of aristocratic Europe, 2 world wars, the occupation and liberation of Paris, and the post-war diplomatic conferences that shaped modern Europe. Its walls contained stories of extraordinary extravagance, marital disaster, military occupation, and cultural debates about what deserves preservation. Bonny de Castellane died in 1932, 37 years before his palace was destroyed. He never had to witness its demolition, never had to see his greatest achievement reduced to rubble. In his memoir, he had written about the Palais Rose with obvious pride, expressing hope that it would bring lasting glory to his architect Ernest Sanson. That hope was not fulfilled. The palace is remembered now primarily for how spectacularly it failed, for how completely it vanished despite its magnificence. The loss teaches us that nothing is permanent, that even buildings constructed from the finest materials with the greatest care can disappear if they're not actively protected. It teaches us that aesthetic decisions made by individuals in power, like Minister Malraux's refusal to classify the building, can have consequences lasting generations. And it teaches us that preserving heritage requires more than appreciation. It requires legal protection, public advocacy, and recognition that some buildings matter not just to their owners, but to entire cultures. The Palais Rose exists now only in fading photographs, scattered furniture pieces in private collections, and stories passed down through generations. It has become a ghost palace, remembered as a symbol of both Belle Époque grandeur and the catastrophic cultural losses of the 1960s. Every preservationist fighting to save a threatened building invokes its name as a warning. This is what happens when we fail to protect what matters. Perhaps that's fitting legacy for a building that was always more symbol than substance, more fantasy than reality. Bonny built it to proclaim his taste and status, to create a stage for performances of wealth and elegance. It was never meant to be practical or sustainable. It was meant to be spectacular, and, in that single aim, it succeeded perfectly. And then Paris let it die. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.